They tried to steal my $15 million logistics empire just 3 days after my wife's funeral. They stood in my home, wearing their expensive tailored grief like a costume, and looked at me with eyes that had already calculated the exact liquidation value of my life's work. They truly believed that a grieving, 70-year-old widower would be an easy target. They thought the sorrow of losing my mate had stripped me of my strength, my wits, and my will to fight. But they made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. They forgot exactly who built the empire they were trying to steal. They forgot that a lone wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth. And I was about to bite back with a cold, mathematical ferocity that would completely tear their comfortable world to pieces. To understand how we ended up in that quiet, suffocating kitchen, with a fraudulent legal document resting on the marble counter, you have to go back to the beginning. The sweet, heavy scent of white funeral lilies still hung thick and cloying in the air of my home. My beloved Diane was gone. 45 years of a beautiful, unbreakable marriage had been brutally cut short by pancreatic cancer in a matter of just 5 agonizing months. The house was painfully, deafeningly quiet now. It was empty in a way that made my chest physically ache with every breath I took. The silence was a heavy physical weight that pressed down on my shoulders, making even the simplest movements feel like an impossible struggle. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water run over my hands as I washed a single, simple glass. It was a mindless, repetitive task, but I needed it. I needed something, anything, to keep my hands busy so my mind would not wander back to the empty, velvet-upholstered chair sitting in the corner of our dark living room. The granite countertop felt freezing cold under my palms. Diane had picked out that specific slab of gray and white granite during our home renovation 10 years ago. She had loved this kitchen. She had spent decades filling it with the warm, rich aromas of Sunday roasts and holiday pies, laughing as she wiped flour from her apron. And now, only 3 days after her body had been lowered into the damp Chicago soil, people who had never truly respected her were standing on her floor, greedily demanding the fruits of her lifelong labor. That was when I heard the sharp, rapid click of expensive designer heels echoing loudly on the oak hardwood floor of the hallway. The sound was aggressive, transactional, and entirely out of place in a house of mourning. I slowly turned off the brass faucet and dried my hands with a linen towel, my movements deliberate and calm. Monica strutted into the kitchen. There was not a single tear in her eyes. There was not a trace of sorrow, respect, or even basic human decency on her perfectly made-up face. She was 39 years old, with sharp, angular features, and she was dressed in an impeccably tailored black Saint Laurent designer suit. She looked significantly more like she was heading into a hostile corporate board meeting to execute a leveraged buyout than a woman mourning the passing of her mother-in-law. Without a single word of comfort, without even bothering to ask how I was holding up after the most devastating week of my entire life, she reached into her leather handbag and dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the granite counter. The sound of the paper hitting the stone was loud, deliberate, and offensive. I looked down at the folder. Printed across the top page in bold black clinical letters were the words, "Emergency Handover and Succession Agreement." I slowly shifted my gaze from the legal folder back up to Monica's cold, calculating eyes. "What is this, Monica?" I asked, my voice flat, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. She let out a long, dramatic, and highly theatrical sigh, rolling her eyes slightly as if she were dealing with a stubborn, slow-witted child who was wasting her valuable time. She leaned her hip against the marble island, crossing her arms over her chest. "It is for your own good, Richard," she said smoothly, her voice carrying a fake, patronizing warmth that made my stomach turn. "You are 70 years old. You just lost Diane, and anyone can see you are completely drowning in your grief. You are in absolutely no mental or physical condition to run Caldwell Logistics right now. The company is too massive, the market is too volatile, and you are far too fragile. You need to sign this agreement today so we can immediately transfer the executive powers to Chase." Chase was my 18-year-old grandson. He was a boy who had barely managed to graduate from his expensive private high school with a C- average. A boy who spent 90% of his time taking pictures of his high-end sports cars for social media, and the other 10% spending his parents' allowances at exclusive downtown clubs. He knew absolutely nothing about supply chains, fleet management, or corporate tax structures. He had never spent a single hour looking at a financial balance sheet. He was a spoiled, entitled child who had never worked a real day in his life. I stared at the legal document, feeling a cold, hard knot form deep in the pit of my stomach. Caldwell Logistics was not just a company to me. It was the physical manifestation of the blood, the sweat, and the tears of my entire adult life. Diane and I had built that $15 million empire from a single, rusty, oil-burning delivery truck back in the winter of 1985. We did not have wealthy venture capitalist investors or Ivy League trust funds. We had exactly $100 in our shared checking account, a stack of unpaid bills, and a shared, desperate dream. We spent our 20s eating cold bologna sandwiches in freezing, snow-slicked parking lots, sleeping in the cramped, drafty cab of that rusty truck, and fighting tooth and nail for every single shipping client we ever secured. While I drove through blinding Midwestern blizzards to make sure our cargo arrived on time, Diane kept the books on a cheap fold-out card table in our tiny one-bedroom apartment, her fingers stiff from the cold as she balanced the ledgers. We sacrificed everything to lay the foundation of this company. And now, only 72 hours after I buried the extraordinary woman who helped me build every single brick of it, my daughter-in-law wanted me to hand the keys of our life's work over to a clueless teenager so she could pull the strings from the shadows. I did not raise my voice. I did not show her even a flicker of the cold fury that was beginning to crystallize in my chest. In 40 years of business, I had learned a fundamental truth. The first one to lose their temper is always the first one to lose the negotiation. I looked at Monica calmly and said, "The company is running just fine, Monica. I am grieving my wife, but I am not incapacitated." Right on cue, as if they had practiced the entire blocking of the scene in front of a mirror, my son Derek walked into the kitchen. He was 42 years old, tall, and dressed in a bespoke Italian wool suit that I had completely paid for. But despite his expensive clothes and his Ivy League credentials, standing next to his overbearing, dominant wife, he looked like a frightened, spineless little boy waiting for his next set of orders. He stepped forward, putting on a highly rehearsed mask of deep, agonizing concern, and placed a hand on my shoulder. I looked at his hand, then at his face. I had funded his entire comfortable life. I had paid for his elite private academies, his prestigious university tuition, his luxury vehicles, and the down payment on his multi-million-dollar North Shore estate. Yet here he was, standing in my kitchen, actively trying to put his own father out to pasture before the grass had even begun to take root on his mother's grave. "Dad, please, just listen to Monica," Derek said, his voice carrying a slight, nervous tremor that he was desperately trying to suppress. "The doctor at your last checkup said your blood pressure's been dangerously high ever since Mom got sick. We are all terribly worried about you. We absolutely do not want to lose you, too. Just sign the succession papers today. Let Chase hold the official executive title in the family trust, and Monica and I will handle all the heavy lifting and daily operations for the company. You can finally rest, travel, and take care of yourself. You won't have to worry about a single thing ever again." It sounded so incredibly caring. It was the perfect, plausible lie. A loving, devoted son and a deeply concerned daughter-in-law stepping up to carry a massive, exhausting burden for a grieving old patriarch. But I knew my son better than anyone else alive. I had spent millions of dollars trying to forge him into a strong, capable leader, only to watch him become a weak, pliable man who could not make a single major decision without his wife's explicit, written permission. He was terrified of her, and he was deeply, desperately in debt. I looked at the expensive gold Montblanc pen that Monica had conveniently and quietly slid out of her purse, placing it directly next to the folder on the counter. "I will think about it," I said quietly, stepping back from the counter and folding my hands behind my back. "I need some time to read through the specific legal clauses and tax implications before I sign my name to anything." Derek nodded eagerly, a visible, pathetic wave of relief washing over his pale face. He was clearly terrified that I would flatly refuse and spark a massive confrontation. "Of course, Dad, take all the time you need," he said, forcing a warm, reassuring smile that did not reach his anxious eyes. "Just don't wait too long. The shipping market is incredibly volatile right now, and the board of directors is nervous. The company needs steady, definitive leadership during this transition." They turned around together, their footsteps fading down the long, carpeted hallway of my house. I stood frozen by the cold granite counter, my heart pounding a slow, heavy mechanical rhythm in my chest. I slowly turned my head toward the large bay window that looked out into the side corridor of the house. The glass was dark against the evening sky, acting like a perfect, clear mirror. In the reflection, I saw Monica and Derek pause near the heavy oak front door. Monica pulled her smartphone out of her designer purse and began to type a message with furious, rapid keystrokes. She had absolutely no idea that from where I was standing in the shadows of the kitchen, I could see her reflection and the movement of her lips perfectly. I watched closely as she hit the send button, a vicious, triumphant, and incredibly ugly smirk spreading across her face. The old man took the bait, she whispered to Derek, her voice carrying faintly down the quiet hallway. Prep the chairs. I stood alone in my quiet, empty kitchen, the warm water still dripping slowly from the faucet with a rhythmic, hollow click. They honestly believed I was a broken, clueless, and senile old widower who would just roll over, sign a piece of paper, and quietly fade into the background. They thought they had outsmarted me in my own home. But they were about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson. I was about to bite back, and I would not stop until I had completely demolished every single thing they held dear. The next morning, I woke up long before the sun even considered rising over the cold waters of Lake Michigan. I had not slept more than 2 hours. The suffocating, empty silence of the house without Diane was unbearable, but the heavy, sickening realization that my own flesh and blood were actively conspiring to steal my life's work made the very air in my bedroom feel thin and toxic. I needed to move. I needed the familiar, powerful hum of my empire to clear the fog from my head. I needed to stand in the halls of Caldwell Logistics and remind myself exactly who I was before I became a broken, old widower in the eyes of my greedy children. By 6 o'clock in the morning, I was pulling my GMC Sierra into my designated executive parking space at the Rosemont Logistics corridor. The crisp, biting autumn air felt sharp against my face as I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the towering multi-story glass headquarters. This building was my sanctuary. I had poured every single ounce of my physical and mental energy into these walls. I walked through the quiet, polished marble lobby, offering a brief nod to the night shift security guard, and took my private elevator straight up to the executive suite. I bypassed my own office and headed directly for the secure executive archives at the very end of the corridor. The archives held the physical, offline backup records of every major financial transaction, board minute, and trust document associated with Caldwell Logistics. If Monica and Derek were planning a hostile legal takeover of the company, they would need to alter or destroy the foundational operating agreements of our family trust. I reached the heavy, reinforced security door of the archive room and pulled my master key card from my wool coat pocket. I swiped the plastic card against the electronic reader, fully expecting the familiar, reassuring beep, the green LED light, and the heavy mechanical click of the locking mechanism. Instead, the electronic keypad beeped a harsh, flat, and aggressive tone. The small digital indicator blinked a solid, angry red. Access denied. I stared at the glowing digital panel, my brow furrowing. My card was the master key. It was hard-coded into the security system to never expire, designed to grant me unlimited, unchecked access to every single room, closet, and server room in this entire building. I swiped the plastic card a second time, pressing it firmly against the sensor. The reader beeped again. Red light. Access denied. I swiped it a third time, my heart beginning to accelerate. Red light. Access completely denied. Are you having some trouble with the security door, Richard? The voice came suddenly from the deep shadows near the break room, startlingly loud and jarring in the quiet, empty hallway. I turned around slowly, my expression hardening as I stepped out into the dim morning light. Walking toward me was Bradley Jenkins. Bradley was our chief financial officer. He was 45 years old, wore a sleek, custom-tailored navy suit, and was wearing far too much expensive sandalwood cologne. The heavy, suffocating scent of his cologne rolled off him in waves, making my stomach turn. He walked with a rehearsed, plastic, and entirely artificial smile plastered across his face. He looked entirely too awake, too polished, and far too comfortable for 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Bradley, I said, my voice perfectly calm, steady, and entirely free of any tremor. My master key card seems to be malfunctioning. It is rejecting my clearance for the executive archives. Bradley stopped a few feet away from me, tucking his manicured hands smoothly into his trouser pockets. Oh, right, he said, his plastic smile widening just a fraction of an inch, revealing a row of perfectly white, expensive veneers. I should have warned you, Richard. We are running a massive system-wide update on our security servers this week. Derek ordered a complete, comprehensive overhaul of our digital access protocols to ensure our corporate data remains absolutely secure. The security system is temporarily restricting access to all sensitive areas while the IT technicians migrate the old files. Derek ordered it? I repeated slowly, letting the name hang in the cold, empty corridor. Bradley nodded smoothly, completely unfazed by my intense gaze. Yes. Derek thought it was best to handle the security migration now. He mentioned to the board that you would be taking an extended, well-deserved leave of absence to mourn the passing of Diane. So he took the proactive initiative to approve the technology overhaul. Don't worry about a single thing, Richard. We have everything completely under control here. You should go home, rest, and let us handle the daily stress. I looked deeply into Bradley Jenkins' cold, calculating eyes. Beneath his polite, professional veneer, I saw a silent, arrogant mockery. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that I knew. They were locking me out of my own company. They were systematically building a digital fortress to hide whatever financial crimes they were currently committing, and they were using my weak-willed son as the compliant face of the operation. The old Richard, the blue-collar brawler who had fought union thugs and corrupt shipping competitors in the 80s, would have grabbed Bradley Jenkins by his silk tie and thrown him through the glass doors of the corridor. I would have demanded the building security team break the archive lock immediately. But the man standing there now was a seasoned corporate veteran. I knew that if I caused a massive scene, I would play right into their hands. I would show my cards. I would give them the exact ammunition they needed to claim I was acting erratically and violently due to my intense grief. I would give Monica the exact proof she needed to show a judge that I was mentally unfit to lead. I am not going to argue with you, Bradley, I said smoothly, forcing a polite, dismissive nod. I suppose a security update is long overdue. Tell Derek I appreciate his sudden, intense interest in our data protection. I turned my back on the chief financial officer and walked calmly toward my private office. I could feel his arrogant, victorious gaze burning into my back as I walked away. But I did not look back. I stepped into my office, closed the heavy oak door, and locked it from the inside. I sat down in my heavy leather chair, staring at the polished oak desk. They honestly believed that shutting off my keycard would blind me. They thought they controlled the flow of information because they controlled the modern, cloud-based servers. But they fundamentally misunderstood how an old wolf protects his territory. They didn't understand that I had built this house, and I knew exactly where all the secret passages were. I reached down, pulled open the bottom drawer of my heavy desk, and slid my hand into the dark cavity. I pressed my thumb against a biometric fingerprint scanner, hidden discreetly underneath the wooden support panel. A small mechanical click echoed in the quiet room, and a secret compartment slid open at the back of the drawer. Inside rested a thick, heavy, dust-covered external hard drive. I did not need their network access. 10 years ago, anticipating the threat of corporate espionage or a hostile board takeover, I had paid a brilliant independent programmer a massive amount of cash to code a silent, invisible backdoor directly into our mainframe. This hard drive contained an offline mirror of every single digital skeleton, ledger, and transaction buried deep within the Caldwell Logistics network. I connected the heavy drive to my secure, isolated laptop. The screen flickered to life, prompting me for a sequence of 3 highly complex, encrypted passwords that only I knew. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to bypass their pathetic firewalls and expose whatever rot Monica and Bradley were hiding in my financial records. But before my finger could press the enter key, the sharp, aggressive ringing of my private cell phone shattered the silence of the room. I jumped slightly, my hand pulling back from the keyboard. Very few people had this specific personal number. Absolutely no one should have been calling it at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. I pulled the phone from my jacket pocket and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed the name of the local county hospital emergency department. A sudden, freezing wave of dread washed over me. Hospitals do not call a 70-year-old man at dawn with good news. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Richard Caldwell?" A woman's voice asked, her tone strictly professional, but carrying an undeniable heavy weight of urgency. "This is the emergency department at Memorial Hospital. I am calling regarding your grandson, Chase Caldwell. He has been involved in a severe motorcycle accident. He is currently in the trauma unit, and we need family members here immediately." I slammed my laptop shut and shoved the encrypted hard drive back into the hidden compartment of my desk. The digital war for Caldwell Logistics would have to wait. My grandson was bleeding. I grabbed my car keys with shaking hands, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I sprinted out of my private office, completely ignoring the confused, startled expression on Bradley Jenkins' face as I rushed past the corporate break room. I slammed my hand against the elevator button, my mind racing with horrific graphic images of Chase lying broken on the cold asphalt. He was a reckless, arrogant teenager with far too much money and far too little common sense, but he was still my family. He was the only grandchild Diane had truly doted on during her final years, the boy she had held and kissed when he was just a baby. The drive to Memorial Hospital was a terrifying, heart-stopping blur of flashing traffic lights, blaring horns and reckless maneuvers through the heavy morning commuter traffic. I broke every single speed limit in the city, gripping the leather steering wheel of my truck until my knuckles turned completely white and my forearms ached with tension. I pushed the accelerator all the way to the floorboard, praying silently that I would not be too late. I abandoned my truck in the emergency ambulance drop-off zone, not caring about the parking violation, and burst through the sliding glass doors of the hospital. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the trauma ward stung my tired, sleep-deprived eyes. The overwhelming, sickening smell of cheap antiseptic and stale waiting room coffee filled the chilly morning air. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the long, sterile hallway. Monica was pacing back and forth, her expensive designer heels clicking a sharp, frantic tempo against the polished linoleum floor. She was furiously typing on her smartphone, looking significantly more inconvenienced and annoyed than devastated. Derek sat slumped in an uncomfortable, orange plastic waiting room chair with his head buried deep in his hands. His expensive tailored suit was severely wrinkled, and his broad shoulders shook slightly under the bright hospital lights. I hurried down the hallway, my heavy footsteps announcing my sudden arrival. Derek looked up, his face extremely pale, his eyes red-rimmed and slick with a nervous sweat. "Dad," he choked out, standing up quickly and wiping his trembling hands on his trousers. "I got here as fast as I possibly could," I said, grabbing his shaking shoulders to steady him. "What exactly happened out there, Derek? How bad is his condition right now?" Derek swallowed hard, his anxious eyes darting briefly toward Monica, who had finally stopped typing to look at me with mild irritation. "He took a sharp corner way too fast on that brand-new sports motorcycle," Derek explained, his voice trembling noticeably. "He lost control of the bike and slid directly into a steel guardrail on the busy highway. He was wearing his protective helmet, thank God, so there is no severe brain damage or spinal trauma. But he suffered a very deep, severe laceration on his left thigh and some minor internal bruising around his ribs. He lost a massive, significant amount of blood at the scene of the accident before the paramedics could arrive and apply a proper tourniquet." Monica aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, letting out a sharp, highly frustrated sigh that echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. "It is a complete and utter disaster, Richard," she scoffed, tossing her phone into her purse. "We were strictly scheduled to meet with the trust lawyers and finalize the executive transfer this afternoon, and now we are stuck sitting in this miserable, depressing waiting room." I stared at her, completely appalled. I was utterly disgusted by her absolute, stunning lack of basic maternal concern. Her only teenage son was currently lying on a surgical operating table, and she was only worried about a corporate handover schedule. Before I could formally reprimand her for her shocking coldness, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open. A very tired-looking attending physician stepped out into the quiet waiting area. He wore blue surgical scrubs that were visibly stained with small, dark spots of fresh blood. His blue surgical mask was pulled down around his neck, revealing a deeply lined, physically exhausted face. "Family of Chase Caldwell," he called out loudly, his authoritative voice echoing down the hospital corridor. We rushed forward together, forming a tight, anxious circle around the exhausted medical professional. "He is medically stable for the moment," the physician said, holding up a thick metal clipboard and clicking his pen. "We managed to successfully stop the primary hemorrhaging in his upper leg, and his vital signs are currently holding steady on the monitors. However, his overall hemoglobin levels are dropping to a critically low, dangerous point. We need to administer a massive blood transfusion immediately to prevent him from slipping into severe hypovolemic shock." Derek let out a loud, shuddering breath of profound relief, leaning heavily against the painted drywall for physical support. "Then do it immediately," Monica demanded, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the doctor. "Give him the required blood and patch him up quickly so we can finally get out of this depressing place. We have a private, luxurious recovery suite waiting for him at our home." The doctor frowned deeply, clearly unimpressed by Monica's demanding, arrogant attitude. His professional tone grew noticeably firm, cold, and uncompromising. "It is not that simple, ma'am," he said, his eyes narrowing. Your son has a very rare, highly specific blood type. He is a B positive. Under normal daily circumstances, this would not be a massive logistical issue. But our hospital blood bank experienced an unprecedented shortage of rare blood types this week due to a massive multi-car pileup on the interstate. We simply do not have enough AB positive or universal O negative donor blood in our immediate hospital inventory to safely and fully complete the required transfusion. He looked directly at Derek, then shifted his serious, urgent gaze to Monica. We need direct family donors right now. Immediately, the doctor said. The boy desperately needs blood, and he needs it flowing into his veins within the next hour to survive. We can bring you both into the laboratory right now, cross-match you immediately, and extract the blood to save your son's life. The world around me seemed to halt completely. The low, mechanical hum of the hospital's ventilation system faded entirely away. The distant, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors in the trauma bay went completely dead in my ringing ears. The attending doctor's specific words echoed loudly in my mind, repeating over and over again like a broken, skipping record. AB positive. The boy is AB positive. My mind, a mind that had been rigorously trained over 4 decades to analyze complex corporate data, detect absolute factual inconsistencies, and spot legal fraud, immediately latched onto a monumental, undeniable biological impossibility. I am an O-negative blood type. My beloved late wife Diane was an O-negative blood type. By the absolute, unbreakable scientific laws of human genetics, 2 biological parents with type O blood can only ever produce children with type O blood. Therefore, my biological son Derek was undeniably, factually an O-negative blood type. I knew this for an absolute, unshakable fact. I vividly remembered the medical paperwork from his severe childhood appendectomy. Monica, as I knew from a brief conversation years ago during a minor family medical scare, was an A-positive blood type. I stood perfectly still in the sterile hospital corridor, staring blankly at the white wall directly behind the doctor. Basic, high school biology began to scream blaring, deafening alarms deep inside my head. An O blood type parent and an A blood type parent can naturally produce an A blood type child. They can occasionally produce an O blood type child. They cannot, under any conceivable scientific or genetic circumstance, ever produce an AB positive child. The dominant B allele had to come from somewhere. It had to come directly from a biological father who actively carried the B genetic trait. Derek absolutely did not carry it. I absolutely did not carry it. Diane absolutely did not carry it. There was only one impossible, horrifying, and devastating conclusion staring me right in the face in that bright, sterile hallway. The teenage boy bleeding out on the surgical operating table. The boy I had spoiled, loved, and spent 18 years preparing to inherit my $15 million logistics empire, did not have a single, solitary drop of Caldwell blood running through his veins. Chase was not my biological grandson. I slowly turned my heavy head to look at Monica. She was furiously arguing with the tired doctor, loudly demanding he call another private hospital to fly the necessary blood in by an emergency helicopter. She was putting on a loud, incredibly aggressive, and theatrical performance to deliberately distract from the obvious, urgent request for her to donate her own blood. She knew she could not donate without exposing the truth. Then I turned my cold, piercing gaze directly to my son. I fully expected to see a man confused by basic genetics. I fully expected to see a worried, grieving father questioning the doctor about a potential, catastrophic laboratory error. But instead, what I saw chilled me to the absolute bone and shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Derek was backed firmly against the painted hospital wall, gripping the metal handrail with bone-white knuckles. He was not looking at the frustrated doctor. He was not looking at his screaming wife, Monica. He was staring firmly, intensely, and desperately at the linoleum floor, his entire body trembling violently under his expensive bespoke suit. He was sweating profusely, heavy beads of moisture rolling down his pale forehead. He was not confused by the science. He was utterly, completely terrified. He absolutely, undeniably knew that the genetic math did not add up. When he finally found the courage to lift his heavy head, he felt my intense, knowing eyes burning right into him. For one brief, absolutely terrifying second, our eyes met across the sterile corridor. He saw the cold, sharp realization settling permanently over my face. He saw that I had done the genetic math in my head and arrived at the devastating truth. Derek immediately broke eye contact, looking away entirely, completely unable to face the father he was actively helping to destroy. The heavy, suffocating silence in the corridor was finally broken when Monica pulled out her platinum credit card, shoving it aggressively toward the doctor. She demanded he contact a neighboring private medical facility and secure the necessary blood supply via an emergency helicopter transport, regardless of the exorbitant financial cost. The doctor, realizing he was dealing with wealthy, arrogant people who firmly believed that money could effortlessly bend reality, nodded curtly and marched back into the trauma bay to make the arrangements. With the immediate medical crisis temporarily diverted by Monica's financial intervention, an uncomfortable, suffocating tension settled over the three of us. We were no longer a family waiting for a routine medical update. We were three people standing on a massive foundation of carefully constructed, 20-year-old lies. And that foundation had just suffered a catastrophic, irreversible structural fracture. The metal elevator clanked and groaned as it descended into the bowels of Memorial Hospital, carrying Derek and me down to the basement cafeteria. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, thick, and suffocating, punctuated only by the low mechanical hum of the elevator shaft. Derek kept his eyes fixed firmly on the blinking floor indicator, his broad shoulders slumped, his chest rising and falling with a shallow, nervous speed. He was still wearing the expensive Italian suit I had bought for him, but under the harsh clinical light of the elevator cab, the fabric looked wrinkled, and his neck was slick with a fresh layer of perspiration. When the doors finally slid open with a dull metallic rattle, we stepped out into a bleak, depressing cavern. The hospital cafeteria was a relic of 60s institutional design, illuminated by flickering, buzzing fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly, pale yellow glow over the rows of cheap plastic tables and the cracked linoleum floor. The air was heavy with the cloying, mismatched scents of burned coffee, stale grease, and strong industrial bleach. Aside from a tired-looking orderly sleeping in a far booth, the room was completely deserted. We walked in silence to the self-service counter. I poured 2 cups of lukewarm, bitter coffee into flimsy styrofoam cups, paid the cashier with a crumpled $10 bill, and led Derek toward a secluded booth in the very back corner, far away from the entrance. Derek sat down heavily, his knees knocking against the metal leg of the sticky plastic table. He gripped his styrofoam cup tightly with both hands, staring intently into the dark, swirling liquid as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling off the edge of the earth. His hands were trembling, the white paper cup bowing slightly under the intense pressure of his grip. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the intensely bitter, metallic taste coat my tongue. I set the cup down precisely on the center of the laminate table, leaned forward slightly, and looked directly into my son's panicked, bloodshot eyes. That was certainly quite a tense moment up there in the hallway with the attending physician, I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft, level, and entirely devoid of accusation. I suppose it is a blessing that Monica was able to use her financial influence to secure that emergency helicopter transport. But I have to admit, Derek, as we were standing there, I found myself getting a little confused by the medical details. Derek did not look up. He squeezed the styrofoam cup even tighter, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. What do you mean, Dad?" he mumbled, his voice sounding thin, dry, and hollow. I leaned in a fraction of an inch closer, resting my rough, calloused forearms on the sticky table. The doctor was very clear about Chase's blood type, Derek. He said the boy is AB positive. Derek swallowed visibly, his throat muscles pulsing sharply against the collar of his tailored shirt. Yeah? So? He's a rare blood type. The doctor said it's not a big deal under normal circumstances. It is a big deal when you understand the genetic math, Derek, I said, my voice dropping into a low, cold, and mathematical whisper. I am an O-negative blood type. Your mother, Diane, was an O-negative blood type. Under the absolute, unbreakable laws of Mendelian genetics, 2 biological parents with type O blood can only ever pass on O alleles to their offspring. They cannot, under any conceivable scientific circumstance, produce a child with A or B alleles, which means, as an absolute, irrefutable biological fact, you are an O-negative blood type. I remember the medical records from your appendectomy when you were 12. Your card clearly stated O-negative. Derek's breathing suddenly hitched. He sat perfectly frozen, his eyes wide, staring blankly at the styrofoam cup. Now let's look at Monica, I continued, my voice steady, relentless, and quiet. Monica is an A-positive blood type. She told us that years ago during her minor surgery. A parent with type O blood and a parent with type O blood can naturally produce a child with type O blood. They can occasionally produce a child with type O blood. But they cannot, they absolutely cannot, under any scientific or biological law in this universe, ever produce a child with type AB positive blood. The dominant B allele must come from a biological parent. You do not carry it, Derek. Your mother did not carry it. I do not carry it. So I am asking you, Derek, how does a boy with an O-negative father and an A-positive mother end up with AB-positive blood? The reaction was instantaneous, and it was devastating. Derek flinched physically, his head jerking back exactly as if I had reached across the table and struck him hard across the face. The nervous sweat that had briefly dried on his forehead returned in a sudden, glistening wave, heavy droplets rolling down his pale temples and dripping onto his silk tie. He slammed his styrofoam cup down onto the table with a sudden violent force, hot coffee splashing over the rim and pooling onto the clean laminate surface. "You are grieving and completely confused, Dad," he snapped, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate and defensive anger that echoed loudly in the empty cafeteria. His face flushed a deep, angry, and unnatural crimson. The laboratory made a simple typographical error on his medical chart. "It happens all the time in these chaotic, understaffed emergency rooms. Do not start your paranoid, crazy interrogations today of all days. My son is currently lying in a trauma bed upstairs, recovering from a near-fatal crash, and you are trying to turn a simple clerical mistake into a ridiculous, insulting conspiracy theory." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full, frantic weight of his explosive outburst. In 40 years of managing a major logistics empire, of sitting across the table from desperate competitors, corrupt union boss negotiators, and fraudulent suppliers trying to cover up major thefts, I had learned to read human behavior with absolute, surgical precision. I knew exactly what righteous, offended innocence looked like. I knew exactly what genuine, puzzled confusion looked like. And I knew exactly what a cornered, guilty coward looked like when the heavy walls of his own deception began to rapidly cave in around him. Derek was not a stupid man, but he was an incredibly poor liar. If he had truly believed that the doctor's statement was a simple, meaningless typographical error, he would have reacted with a tired, exasperated sigh. He would have gently patted my hand, reminded me that clinical staff make clerical mistakes during crises, and told me to focus on Chase's recovery. But he didn't do that. He attacked me. He immediately became aggressively defensive. He instantly tried to weaponize my fresh, raw grief over Diane's passing, to deflect a completely logical, scientifically sound question. His uncharacteristic, explosive hostility was the ultimate, irrefutable confirmation of my absolute worst, most terrifying suspicion. He knew, my son Derek knew. He was not confused by the genetic math. He was utterly, completely petrified because he realized that the 20-year-old lie he had been living was finally being laid bare. As I stared across the table at the sweating, trembling man sitting in front of me, a profound, incredibly heavy sadness washed over my soul. This was my son. This was the boy Diane and I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. While we were sleeping in the cramped, drafty cab of our single delivery truck in 1985, eating cold bologna sandwiches in freezing Chicago parking lots, we were dreaming of the secure, beautiful future we could give this boy. We had poured millions of dollars into his elite, privileged upbringing. We paid for his exclusive private schools, his lavish summer camps, his prestigious Ivy League university education, and his luxury North Shore lifestyle. We gave him every single advantage we never had, hoping to forge a strong, intelligent, and capable leader who would carry our empire into the next generation. But all that money, all that privilege, and all that expensive education had only managed to produce a remarkably weak-willed, spineless follower. Derek had returned from his prestigious university not as a confident leader, but as a man completely devoid of a strong internal compass. He was a man who consistently preferred the comfortable path of least resistance, a man who deferred entirely to the strongest, most dominant personality in the room. And unfortunately for both of us, the strongest personality he had ever encountered was his highly manipulative, socially ambitious wife, Monica. She had quickly realized exactly how pliable he was, and she had spent the last 2 decades carefully molding him into a compliant, silent accessory to her own grand, greedy ambitions. He was not a partner in his own marriage. He was a hostage who had slowly fallen in love with his captor. I let the tense, heavy silence stretch between us, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to let him off the hook. "You are probably right, Derek," I finally said, my voice dropping into a soft, chilling whisper that made him shiver. "It must simply be a typographical error, after all. What other possible explanation could there be?" My words were carefully chosen, heavily layered with an unmistakable, underlying threat that hung in the chilly air between us. Derek swallowed hard, his neck muscles bobbing sharply against his collar. He quickly averted his eyes, completely unable to sustain the intense, knowing pressure of my gaze. He mumbled a weak, incoherent agreement, blindly staring down at the spilled coffee on the table. He knew that I knew, and he knew that he was entirely powerless to stop the storm that was rapidly gathering on the horizon. "Take a moment to gather yourself, son," I said quietly, standing up slowly from the flimsy plastic chair and buttoning my wool overcoat with deliberate, measured movements. "I am going to head back upstairs to check on the arrival of the emergency transport." I walked away without waiting for his response, leaving him alone in the depressing, fluorescent-lit basement to drown in his own suffocating guilt. I rode the slow, rumbling elevator back up to the surgical floor, my mind operating with a cold, mathematical precision. I was already calculating variables, mapping out potential legal and financial countermeasures, and identifying the key players in this conspiracy. When the elevator doors slid open on the trauma ward, I did not immediately walk back to the waiting room. Instead, I paused behind the thick concrete structural pillar near the nurse's station, keeping myself completely concealed in the deep shadows. Further down the long, sterile hallway, standing near the large glass windows that overlooked the bustling Rosemont streets below, was Monica. She was whispering furiously into her smartphone, pacing wildly, her sharp movements betraying a manic, desperate energy. It was absolutely not a laboratory typographical error. Chase is definitely not a biological Caldwell. I desperately need undeniable, physical proof, and I know exactly how I will get it. The emergency helicopter arrived shortly after Monica made her frantic, expensive phone calls. The blood transfusion was an absolute success. Chase's vitals stabilized quickly, and within a few hours, the attending physician declared him out of any immediate danger. By late afternoon, the hospital formally discharged him with crutches, a heavy prescription for pain medication, and strict orders to rest in bed for the next 2 weeks. Throughout the entire discharge process, I played the part of the relieved, loving grandfather to absolute perfection. I hugged Derek, offered Monica a supportive, warm smile, and told them I would check in on them later that evening. Then, I went straight back to my empty house and prepared for a very different kind of operation. I needed undeniable forensic proof, and I needed it secured before they realized I was on to their deception. I purchased 2 large containers of premium chicken noodle soup from a local deli, transferring the hot liquid into my own glass containers to make it look like a homemade, heartfelt gesture. I slipped a fresh pair of surgical latex gloves and 3 sterile, zippered plastic bags into the deep pocket of my heavy wool overcoat. The sun had completely set by the time I pulled my GMC Sierra into the winding driveway of their North Shore estate. It was a massive, stone-facade mansion with perfectly manicured lawns, an estate that had been entirely funded by my hard work. I had written the multi-million-dollar down payment check 3 years ago, foolishly believing I was securing a stable, beautiful environment for the boy I thought was my biological flesh and blood. Now, looking at the warm, glowing windows of the house, I felt a deep, sickening sense of violation. I walked up the stone steps and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Derek opened the door. He looked completely drained, his eyes hollow, still wearing the wrinkled trousers and shirt from the hospital. "Dad," he said, his voice laced with surprise and a hint of immediate anxiety. You really did not have to come out here tonight. You should be home resting." I held up the glass containers of soup, offering a gentle, fatherly smile. "I could not sleep, son," I said softly. "I know you and Monica must be absolutely exhausted after today. I brought some warm, fresh soup so you don't have to worry about cooking dinner." Derek stepped aside, allowing me into the grand, marble-floored foyer. The house was quiet, the thick, plush carpets absorbing the sound of my heavy footsteps. We walked into the sprawling gourmet kitchen. Monica was sitting at the marble island, a half-empty glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon in her hand, and a stack of hospital discharge papers spread out in front of her. She did not bother to stand up or greet me. Instead, she immediately began to complain loudly about the exorbitant highway robbery cost of the emergency medical helicopter transport she had demanded just hours earlier. I set the glass containers of soup down on the counter, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "Health and safety have no price tag, Monica," I replied smoothly. "We are blessed that Chase is resting comfortably upstairs in his own bed." Monica rolled her eyes and took another deep sip of her wine, completely missing the double meaning hidden behind my words. Derek offered to heat up the soup, moving slowly toward the commercial-grade stove. I seized the opportunity immediately. "I'm going to wash my hands and check in on the boy for just a quick second," I said casually, turning away from the kitchen before either of them could offer an objection. I walked up the grand, curved staircase, my heart beating with a cold, precise rhythm. The second floor of the mansion was dimly lit and silent. I walked past the master bedroom and headed straight for the end of the long hallway where Chase had his private suite. I pushed his bedroom door open just a fraction of an inch. He was fast asleep in his king-sized bed, his heavily bandaged left leg propped up on a stack of soft pillows, a pair of active noise-canceling headphones covering his ears. I quietly closed the door and slipped directly into his private attached bathroom. The room smelled strongly of expensive men's cologne and mint toothpaste. I reached into my overcoat pocket and pulled out the sterile plastic bags and the surgical latex gloves. I snapped the gloves over my hands, moving with the silent, practiced efficiency of a man completely focused on his mission. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet above the double porcelain sink. There, resting in a sleek ceramic holder, was his blue electric toothbrush. The bristles were still slightly damp from his recent use. It was a perfect, uncontaminated source of raw genetic material, rich with saliva and cheek cells. I carefully extracted the toothbrush, making absolutely sure not to touch the bristlehead, and dropped it directly into the first sterile plastic bag, sealing the tight plastic zipper shut. I locked the evidence away in my deep pocket and closed the medicine cabinet without making a single sound. That was half the battle. Now, I needed Derek's genetic material. I peeled the latex gloves off, slipped out of the bathroom, and walked silently back down the carpeted hallway. Instead of returning directly to the kitchen, I took a sharp detour toward the large laundry room and mudroom located just off the spacious four-car garage. Derek was a creature of absolute rigid habit. He went to an executive gym 3 times a week, and he always dumped his sweaty workout gear into a specific wicker hamper by the garage door, entirely too lazy to carry it to the washing machine himself. I stepped into the dark mudroom, my eyes scanning the organized shelves and hooks. I found the wicker hamper immediately. Resting right on top of the pile was his dark gray athletic jacket. The very jacket he had carelessly tossed there yesterday afternoon, before the medical emergency completely derailed their week. I put on a fresh pair of surgical gloves and picked up the dark fabric, holding it up toward the dim security light filtering in through the window. I scrutinized the high neckline and the soft inner lining with intense focus. It took me exactly 30 seconds to find what I needed. Woven into the sweaty fabric near the collar were several distinct dark brown hairs. I pulled a pair of small metal tweezers from my pocket, gripped the very tips of the hairs, and carefully plucked them from the jacket lining. I held them up to the light, confirming that the tiny, whitish biological root follicles were still perfectly intact at the base. It was more than enough biological material for a definitive DNA profile. I dropped the hairs into the second sterile plastic bag, sealed it tight, and placed it securely next to the toothbrush in my coat pocket. I took off the gloves, smoothed out the wrinkles in my overcoat, and walked casually back into the kitchen. Derek was just pouring the warm soup into 3 porcelain bowls. I smiled warmly, played the role of the tired, deeply relieved grandfather for another 10 minutes, and then gracefully excused myself, claiming that the long, emotional day had finally caught up with my aging body. They watched me walk out the front door, completely unaware that I was walking away with the absolute destruction of their entire, carefully constructed world safely tucked inside my pocket. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and drove out of their pristine suburban neighborhood. But I did not drive back to my empty house. I turned my GMC Sierra onto the dark interstate highway, pressed the accelerator down, and drove straight through the dark night to a private genetics laboratory located 2 towns over. I had called them during my drive, utilizing a premium emergency service line to arrange a deeply confidential, after-hours appointment. I arrived at the sleek, unmarked medical building just past 2 in the morning. A stern-looking laboratory technician in a white coat let me in through the heavy glass security doors. I handed him the 2 perfectly sealed plastic bags and a thick envelope containing exactly $5,000 in crisp, clean, untraceable cash. I demanded a highly expedited priority analysis. The technician counted the cash carefully, labeled the plastic bags with random numerical barcodes to ensure complete anonymity, and promised me definitive, legally binding results within 48 hours. Soon, I walked out of the private clinic as the first faint streaks of purple dawn broke across the eastern horizon. The biting morning chill whipped my face, but I felt a strange burning heat radiating deep within my chest. I had the biological evidence secured. The scientific hammer was officially in motion. I unlocked my truck and slid into the cold leather driver's seat. letting out a long, heavy breath. I reached into my pocket for my keys, but my fingers brushed against my smartphone. The screen suddenly lit up, the dark interior of the truck vibrating violently against my palm. It was an automated security alert. It was triggered directly from the secret digital backdoor I had coded into the Caldwell Logistics server 10 years ago. I stared at the glowing text, feeling the blood freeze completely solid in my veins. Someone inside the company was actively attempting to authorize a massive, unapproved wire transfer of exactly $4.5 million, and they were desperately trying to use my personal digital signature to do it. I threw my truck into gear and tore out of the clinic parking lot, the tires screeching loudly on the asphalt. The sun was fully rising now, painting the morning sky in vibrant streaks of orange and gold, but my world had never felt colder or darker. My mind raced faster than the engine of my car. Whoever was sitting at a computer terminal, attempting to push that massive wire transfer through the Caldwell Logistics system, was getting desperate. They were trying to bypass the primary authentication protocols by using a forged, digital version of my signature. I did not drive back to the corporate headquarters. Confronting Bradley Jenkins or whoever was sitting at that desk would only give them the opportunity to scrub the servers and destroy the digital evidence before I could secure it. I drove straight back to my house, the large, empty home that felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. I bypassed the kitchen and walked down the long, carpeted hallway to my private home office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and closed the thick wooden blinds, plunging the room into deep shadows. I turned on my green banker's desk lamp and sat down in front of my secure home terminal. 10 years ago, when Caldwell Logistics was rapidly expanding, and we were fending off aggressive corporate espionage from rival logistics firms, I hired a brilliant independent programmer to build a fail-safe into our network architecture. It was a digital ghost, a completely invisible backdoor coded directly into the foundational framework of the company servers. I never told Diane about it, and I certainly never told Derek or the board of directors. It was my ultimate insurance policy, designed for a catastrophic scenario just like this one. I booted up the terminal and typed in a complex sequence of commands that had not been used in a decade. The screen flashed black, then flooded with cascading lines of green code. I was in. I navigated through the invisible pathways of the network, bypassing the heavily advertised corporate firewalls without triggering a single internal security alarm. I located the active terminal that had initiated the security alert. It was registered to the executive financial suite. Bradley Jenkins was already awake and working early, furiously trying to force a heavily encrypted wire transfer through the system using a spoofed credential package designed to mimic my authorization. I watched his digital keystrokes in real time, like a phantom observing a burglar trying to pick a lock. Bradley was a slick, calculating accountant, but his understanding of deep network architecture was arrogant and fundamentally flawed. He had established a series of internal lockouts to blind the general accounting staff and block my standard administrative access, but his walls were built entirely on the surface level. He had absolutely no idea that I was swimming beneath the foundation of his digital fortress. With a few precise keystrokes, I isolated his transfer request and quietly quarantined the transaction, suspending the $4.5 million in a hidden digital purgatory where he could neither complete the transfer nor cancel the footprint of his attempt. I had him perfectly trapped. My heart pounded with a mix of fury and intense focus as I prepared to dig deeper into the system. I needed to see exactly how long this disease had been spreading through my company, and I needed to gather every single piece of undeniable evidence before they realized they were caught. Having stopped the immediate financial hemorrhage, I turned my attention to the origin of the rot. I needed to see exactly how deep this infection went. I traced the destination of the blocked wire transfer, following the complex routing numbers through a dizzying maze of offshore routing protocols and disguised corporate entities. What I found was a sophisticated, highly organized labyrinth of financial fraud. Bradley had not just been skimming off the top. He had engineered a massive systemic pipeline designed to drain the lifeblood of my company. I uncovered 4 distinct shell companies, all recently registered in the state of Delaware under fake limited liability corporations. They had generic, meaningless names that blended perfectly into a standard corporate expense report. Global Freight Solutions, Apex Logistics Consulting, Horizon Management Partners, and Zenith Supply Chain Associates. I opened the accounting ledgers connected to these phantom companies, The digital paper trail revealed a relentless barrage of fabricated invoices for phantom consulting services, non-existent software upgrades, and dummy logistical routes that Caldwell Logistics had supposedly subcontracted. The sheer volume of the fake invoices was staggering, but they were carefully calculated to slide just beneath the threshold of an automatic secondary board review. Bradley had meticulously orchestrated the payments to look like standard operational expenses, masking the theft behind a wall of tedious corporate bureaucracy. I began downloading every single ledger, every fake invoice, and every routing number onto my secure hard drive, ensuring I had a permanent, unalterable record of their massive criminal enterprise. The depth of the deception was sickening, revealing a level of calculated greed that completely shattered any lingering illusions I had about the people operating within my own corporate headquarters. I dug deeper, matching the dates of the fraudulent invoices with the corresponding outflow of corporate capital. I pulled up the master ledger of the company and cross-referenced the missing capital against our internal accounts. When the numbers finally aligned on my glowing screen, a wave of profound nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of my heavy oak desk to steady myself. The money was not coming from our operational revenue. It was not coming from our expansion reserves. The $4.5 million that Bradley and Monica had siphoned away over the past 8 months was being systematically drained directly from the employee pension fund. They were stealing the hard-earned retirement savings of the truck drivers, warehouse managers, and logistics coordinators who had dedicated their lives to building this company alongside me. But the absolute worst part was the timeline. I stared at the dates of the largest outgoing wire transfers, feeling a sharp, twisting agony in my chest. The first massive withdrawal was initiated exactly 8 months ago. That was exactly the same week Diane received her terminal cancer diagnosis. While I was sitting in sterile, freezing oncology waiting rooms, holding my dying wife's fragile, skeletal hand and crying over her hospital bed, my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer were busy plundering the company vaults. They knew I was completely distracted by grief and medical decisions. They knew my attention was entirely focused on the woman I loved more than life itself. They weaponized my pain and used Diane's tragic decline as a convenient, prolonged distraction to orchestrate their massive theft. Every single time Monica visited the hospice facility, pretending to comfort us, she was actively calculating how much more she could steal. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the glow of the computer monitor illuminating the dark room. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together with terrifying clarity. The massive embezzlement of the pension fund, the fake Delaware corporations, the desperate, panicked attempt to push a final wire transfer through the system at dawn, and the sudden, aggressive push for me to sign the succession documents mere days after Diane's funeral. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder Monica had slammed onto my kitchen counter the day before. The emergency handover and succession agreement. I flipped past the first few pages of legal jargon regarding executive powers and skipped directly to the final clauses buried at the very end of the extensive document. There it was, hidden beneath layers of dense corporate terminology, a comprehensive indemnification clause completely absolving the new executive board of any prior financial discrepancies, and a mandatory authorization for the upcoming end-of-year audit, bearing my signature as the sole approving authority. The handover document was never about taking power. It was never about Monica wanting to rule the company from the shadows. The document was a meticulously crafted legal shield. The end-of-year corporate audit was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. An independent auditing firm would tear through the company ledgers, and it would take them less than an hour to notice a gaping $4.5 million hole in the employee pension fund. When the federal investigators inevitably arrived to comb through the wreckage, they would demand answers. They would look at the digital authorization logs. They would see the spoofed credentials holding my digital signature. And if I signed that handover document, I would be legally authenticating all financial operations prior to the transfer of power. Monica and Bradley were not just stealing my money. They were meticulously framing me for the entire operation. They intended to use my signature to bury the massive embezzlement entirely under my name. They needed my signature to seal my coffin, and they were willing to use my raw grief to get it. But they vastly, catastrophically underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. I was no longer a grieving, broken widower. I was the architect of this company, and I was about to systematically tear their entire world down to the absolute ground. The transition from desperate, agonizing suspicion to the cold, undeniable realm of scientific reality is a quiet, brutal process. For 48 hours, I lived inside the digital and physical shadows of my own life. I sat in my quiet home office, surrounded by the heavy mahogany bookshelves Diane and I had selected together, and watched the green lines of code cascade down my secure laptop screen. I had isolated the $4.5 million pension fund transaction, trapping it in a digital quarantine that Bradley Jenkins could neither complete nor erase. I had built the digital walls of my trap, but as the morning of the third day broke over Lake Michigan, painting the gray Chicago sky in cold, pale streaks of amber, the physical world came knocking. My private burner phone, resting silently on the dark leather blotter of my desk, vibrated violently. The aggressive mechanical buzz cut through the absolute quiet of the room like a gunshot. I picked it up on the second ring, my hand completely steady. "Richard Caldwell," I said, my voice flat, level, and entirely devoid of human warmth. "Mr. Caldwell," a sterile, clinical voice on the other end of the line responded. "This is the secure reception desk at the private genetics lab. The expedited comparative DNA analysis you commissioned has been officially completed, verified by our senior pathologist, and sealed. The physical hard copy of the report is ready for immediate pickup. Due to the highly confidential nature of the profile, we will not transmit these findings electronically. You must retrieve them in person using your assigned numerical barcodes." "I am on my way," I said quietly, and disconnected the call. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline. I did not feel a sudden, frantic panic. I felt a strange, hollow calmness settle over my chest. I reached into my closet and pulled out my heavy wool overcoat. I slipped my car keys into my pocket, walked down the long, empty hallway, and stepped out onto the front porch. The Chicago autumn wind was biting, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the lake and rustling the dry brown oak leaves across my manicured lawn. I climbed into my GMC Sierra, started the engine, and backed down the gravel driveway. The drive to the private clinic was vastly different from the frantic, heart-stopping run I had made to the hospital 3 days prior. When I had rushed to Chase's bedside, I was a grandfather fueled by a desperate, protective instinct, breaking speed limits to reach a bleeding boy I believed carried my bloodline. Today, I was a predator navigating a carefully calculated grid, moving with a silent, deadly precision toward my own killing floor. I watched the normal commuters in their sedans and SUVs, listening to the morning radio hosts drone on about the volatile financial markets, completely oblivious to the silent, catastrophic war that was currently tearing my family apart. I parked in the clean, unmarked asphalt lot of the private medical facility, stepped inside the quiet lobby, and walked directly to the high reception desk. The young woman behind the glass checked her computer screen as I pushed the small paper containing my numerical barcodes across the counter. She did not ask for my name. She did not ask for any identifying information. $5,000 in cash I had handed over 3 nights ago had secured absolute, unquestioning anonymity. She turned around, unlocked a heavy steel filing cabinet, and retrieved a thick, tamper-proof manila envelope. She slid it across the smooth counter, her face wearing a polite, professional smile. She had absolutely no idea that inside that paper casing was a scientific bomb that would permanently obliterate my family. "Have a wonderful day, sir," she said gently. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady as stone. I took the envelope, feeling its heavy physical weight in my hands. I did not open it in the lobby. I did not open it in the hallway. I walked back out through the sliding glass doors, the automated hum of the entrance sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, closed the heavy door, and locked it. The deep, rhythmic rumble of the diesel motor filled the insulated cabin, and the heater began to blow warm air over my cold hands. But it did absolutely nothing to thaw the freezing ice that had permanently settled in my chest. I sat in the idling truck, staring at the blank face of the manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. For 18 years I had looked at Chase Caldwell, desperately searching for traces of my own facial features in his adolescent frame. I had looked for Diane's bright, resilient smile in his expressions, and my own relentless, driving determination in his actions. I had spoiled him, protected him, and spent his entire life preparing him to inherit a $15 million logistics empire, because I believed he was the sacred continuation of our bloodline. Now, I was about to find out if I had been searching for ghosts. I took a deep, steadying breath, reached over, and picked up the envelope. I slid my index finger under the sealed paper flap and tore it open with one swift, decisive motion. I pulled out the crisp, white laboratory report. The document was dense with complex genetic markers, biological sequencing charts, and technical medical terminology. But I bypassed the complicated data and let my eyes drop directly to the bold, capitalized conclusion printed clearly at the very bottom of the final page. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. The biological samples from subject Chase Caldwell do not share a paternal genetic relationship with the biological samples from subject B, Derek Caldwell. The subject noun as cases definitively and permanently, exclade as the biological offspring of the subject noun as Dirk Caldwell. I read the numbers again, 0.0%. There was no margin for error, there was no statistical anomaly. It was a complete, undeniable biological zero. The teenage boy I had loved, supported, and was currently being blackmailed to hand my entire life's work over to did not possess a single solitary drop of Caldwell blood. Diane's sacred lineage, family legacy we had worked so incredibly hard to secure, had died the moment my beautiful wife took her final breath in that quiet hospice bed. For exactly 1 minute, a wave of profound, crushing grief washed over me. I mourned the loss of the grandson I thought I had. I mourned the absolute 20-year deception that had robbed me of a true legacy. I grieved for Diane, thanking whatever silent higher power existed that she had passed away in peace, before having to witness this sickening, grotesque betrayal. But the grief did not last. It was almost instantly eradicated, burned away by a cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying rage. The sorrow was completely eclipsed by the sharp, focused clarity of an experienced corporate predator who had just realized he was completely surrounded by vicious, smiling monsters in his own home. I folded the laboratory report perfectly in half and placed it securely into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket, resting it right against my chest. My mind, rigorously trained by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, began to rapidly process the new variables of the battlefield. If Derek was not the biological father of the boy, then who was? Monica was a highly calculating, incredibly ambitious, and socially aggressive woman. She was not a reckless teenager who would risk her extremely comfortable, heavily subsidized lifestyle on a random, meaningless affair with a stranger. If she was going to commit an infidelity that could potentially destroy her lucrative marriage to the sole heir of a $15 million logistics empire, she would do it with someone useful. She would do it with someone who could actively help her achieve her ultimate goal of absolute financial control. She would partner with someone who understood exactly how to manipulate massive sums of corporate money without triggering internal alarms. She would partner with someone who had deep, unrestricted access to the complex financial architecture of Caldwell Logistics. The realization struck me with the force of a speeding freight train. The missing $4.5 million from the employee pension fund. The fake shell companies registered in Delaware. The frantic early morning attempt to push a massive wire transfer through our system at dawn. Monica was not orchestrating this massive corporate embezzlement all by herself. She had a highly skilled, deeply embedded partner on the inside. She had a partner who had been helping her drain my company to the bone while my wife was dying in a hospice bed. I threw the truck into gear, pulled out of the medical clinic parking lot, and set my destination. I was not going back to the office, and I was not going home. I was going to war, and I needed a professional soldier to gather my ammunition. I drove to a nondescript, 3-story professional building located in a quiet industrial district on the very edge of the city. I walked through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the sparse, utilitarian office of Robert Sanchez. Robert was an ex-federal agent, a man who had spent 20 years hunting down white-collar criminals, dismantling organized syndicates, and tracking illicit offshore money trails for the FBI before transitioning into a highly lucrative, strictly confidential career as a private investigator. He was ruthless, incredibly efficient, and entirely devoid of moral hesitation when properly compensated. I sat down in the uncomfortable leather chair across from his dark metal desk. I did not offer a greeting. I did not waste a single second on polite pleasantries. I reached into my wool overcoat pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and signed a blank check. I slid the crisp piece of paper across the metal desk, leaving the financial amount completely empty. Robert looked down at the blank check, his dark, heavy-lidded eyes narrowing with intense professional curiosity. I need you to dig up every single shadow Monica Caldwell has ever cast, both before and after she managed to marry my son. I instructed, my voice hard, flat, and unforgiving like cracked ice. I want to know where she spends her afternoons, what she buys, where she travels, and exactly who she meets when she thinks nobody is looking. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want her entire life completely dismantled and laid bare on my desk. Robert slowly picked up the blank check, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his weathered, scarred face. "Where exactly would you like me to start, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked quietly. I leaned forward, the cold rage burning brightly in my chest. "Start with Bradley Jenkins." For the next 3 days, I walked through my life like a ghost. I went to the office, attended routine administrative meetings, and reviewed quarterly logistics projections, as if the ground beneath my feet had not completely collapsed into a toxic abyss. I nodded at Bradley Jenkins when we passed in the executive hallway, offering him the same polite, professional smile I had given him for years. I answered Derek's increasingly anxious phone calls regarding the succession documents, assuring him in a weary, defeated voice that I just needed a little more time to finalize my affairs before signing my name. Every word I spoke, every gesture I made, was a carefully calculated performance. I was a man standing in the center of a burning room, calmly adjusting his tie while quietly bolting all the exit doors from the inside. They believed they were watching a powerful, aging titan slowly fade into absolute irrelevance due to the overwhelming, suffocating grief of losing his wife. They had absolutely no idea they were actually watching a predator patiently arranging his killing floor. On the evening of the third day, my secure burner phone finally buzzed. It was a single text message from Robert Sanchez. It contained a specific address for a 24-hour diner located on the industrial outskirts of Chicago, and at the time, 11:30 p.m. I arrived 15 minutes early, pulling my truck into the dimly lit, pothole-ridden asphalt parking lot. The diner was a relic from another era, its flickering neon sign buzzing loudly in the cold, damp night air. Inside, the place smelled strongly of stale fryer grease, cheap bleach, and burned black coffee. Robert was already sitting in a sticky, green vinyl booth, tucked far away in the back corner of the desolate room, completely hidden from the large front windows. He was nursing a thick ceramic mug of black coffee, his face an unreadable mask of professional stoicism. As I slid into the booth across from him, he did not offer a greeting. He simply reached into his worn brown leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He slid it slowly across the scarred laminate table until it bumped gently against my folded hands. "You were absolutely right to start with Bradley Jenkins, Mr. Caldwell," Robert said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that barely carried over the loud hum of the diner's ancient refrigerator units. They were not exceptionally careful. Arrogance rarely is. I stared down at the thick dossier, my fingers resting lightly on the rough paper, feeling the profound, terrifying weight of the secrets locked inside. I opened the cover. The very first page was a high-resolution, telephoto photograph date-stamped just 3 weeks ago. It showed Monica Caldwell and Bradley Jenkins sitting close together at a highly secluded corner table in an upscale, out-of-town restaurant in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Bradley was leaning in, his manicured hand resting intimately over hers, their faces close in private, animated conversation. It was not a corporate business meeting. It was the undeniable, highly charged body language of two people who shared a deep, familiar, and highly secretive history. They did not meet at Caldwell Logistics during our corporate restructuring event 5 years ago, as they had always claimed, Robert explained, tapping a thick stack of printed documents near the back of the folder. I pulled their undergraduate university records. They met 20 years ago at an out-of-state business college in Ohio. They were college sweethearts, Mr. Caldwell. They lived together in a rented off-campus apartment for 2 full years before graduation. When they realized neither of them possessed the familial wealth or connections necessary to fund their incredibly expensive, luxurious ambitions, they apparently made a strategic, long-term corporate decision. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning hotel receipts, credit card statements, and private flight manifests that painted a clear, undeniable picture of a continuous, highly coordinated, and completely hidden 19-year affair. They had maintained their romantic and financial partnership the entire time Monica had been maneuvering her way into my son's life, and long after she had successfully secured her position as the daughter-in-law of the Caldwell family. "And the boy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though my heart already knew the devastating answer. Robert nodded slowly, his expression grim and completely devoid of humor. "I secured a discrete biological sample from Bradley Jenkins' private trash yesterday morning. A discarded coffee cup. I expedited the genetic analysis against the data you obtained from the grandson's toothbrush. Bradley Jenkins is undeniably, factually the biological father of Chase Caldwell. He paused, letting the reality sink in. They essentially planted a cuckoo bird directly in your nest, Mr. Caldwell. They wanted to ensure they had a permanent, biological anchor tied directly to your family's $15 million fortune. Monica used your weak-willed son to gain access to your wealth, and she used her biological child with Bradley to ensure they possessed a permanent, unbreakable claim to the family inheritance. They manipulated your love, your pride, and your deep desire for a grandson to cement their ultimate financial security. The revelation hit me with a sickening, dizzying clarity. It was an incredibly long con, a 19-year strategic infiltration designed to slowly, methodically siphon the lifeblood of my empire from the inside out. But the true devastation, the absolute, killing blow, was still waiting for me, in the depths of Robert's meticulous investigation. Robert reached across the sticky table, pulled a single sheet of printed paper from a secondary sleeve in the folder, and slid it toward me. "This was the most difficult piece of the puzzle to extract," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I had to utilize some highly unconventional digital retrieval methods to pull this from a deleted, archived personal server. But I thought it was absolutely critical that you saw the entire picture before you made your move." I looked down at the paper, my eyes scanning the printed text. It was a copy of a private email, date-stamped exactly 10 years ago, sent from a heavily encrypted personal account belonging to my son, Derek, addressed directly to Monica's private email address. I began to read, my heart turning into a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Monica T. The email read, "I got the test results back from the fertility specialist today. It is officially confirmed. I am completely sterile. The childhood mumps infection caused permanent, irreversible damage. There is absolutely zero chance of me ever fathering a biological child. We have to be incredibly carefully quiet about this. If my mother finds out, if she realizes I cannot provide a biological heir, she will invoke the bloodline clause in her family trust. She will cut me out completely and leave everything to charity. We have to maintain the illusion at all costs. My father must never find out. Chase is the only thing keeping my inheritance secure." The quiet diner completely faded away. The smell of grease, the hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of the few other late-night patrons, it all vanished into a ringing, suffocating void of absolute betrayal. Derek knew. He had known for 10 long years. He knew that Chase was not his biological son, and he knew that Monica had brought another man's child into our family. But instead of confronting the betrayal, instead of coming to me or his mother with the truth, my son had actively, willingly chosen to become an accomplice to the grand deception. He had participated in a massive, sustained financial fraud because he was absolutely, pathetically terrified of losing his inheritance. Diane had always been fiercely protective of the Caldwell legacy. She had insisted on a strict, ironclad clause in our family trust, stating that the bulk of our corporate assets and personal wealth would only ever be transferred to direct, biological descendants of the Caldwell bloodline. She wanted to ensure that the empire we built from a single, rusty delivery truck would never be handed over to opportunistic outsiders. Derek knew about this clause. He knew that his sterility meant he could never fulfill his mother's strict requirement for ultimate control of the trust. And so, driven by sheer, unadulterated greed and a pathetic, cowardly desperation to maintain his luxurious North Shore lifestyle, he had struck a disgusting bargain with Monica. He would raise Bradley Jenkins' child, pretend to be a proud, loving father, and actively deceive his own parents for nearly 2 decades, all to ensure his claim to a $15 million fortune remained secure. He had sold his mother's honor and his father's trust for a monthly paycheck. He had watched me spoil a child that was not mine, watched me beam with pride at the boy I thought would carry my name into the future. And he had done it all while silently calculating exactly how much money it would eventually bring him. I sat in the uncomfortable green vinyl booth, staring at the printed email until the letters blurred together into a meaningless black smudge. The profound sorrow that had briefly touched me at the genetics clinic was completely gone now. It was entirely replaced by a cold, absolute, and terrifyingly clear purpose. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was no longer a disappointed, aging father. I was an executioner who had been marked for slaughter by the very people he had spent his entire life protecting and providing for. And I was about to drop the floor out from under them. I folded the email carefully, placed it back into the thick manila dossier, and closed the cover. I looked up at Robert Sanchez, who was watching me with silent, professional respect. He recognized the shifting energy in my demeanor. He saw the predator finally wake up and take complete control of the hunt. "Thank you for your exceptional work, Robert," I said, my voice perfectly steady, resonant, and completely devoid of any human warmth. "Your investigation has provided exactly what I needed to proceed." Robert nodded slowly, picking up his cold coffee mug. "What is your next move, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked quietly. I stood up from the sticky vinyl booth, tucking the heavy dossier securely under my arm. "I am going to go home, Robert," I said, buttoning my wool overcoat with deliberate, slow movements. "I am going to invite my loving son and his devoted wife into my study, and I am going to play the role of the broken, defeated old man they so desperately want me to be. I am going to give them exactly enough rope to securely hang themselves." I drove back to my large, empty house in Lake Forest, the thick manila dossier resting heavily on the passenger seat of my truck. The yellow streetlights flickered past, casting long, shifting shadows across the dark leather interior. My mind was a steel trap, perfectly compartmentalizing the profound, sickening betrayal I had just uncovered. There would be time for anger later. There would be time to mourn the son I thought I had, and the grandson who was never mine. But right now, I needed absolute, unwavering focus. I needed to execute a performance so convincing that it would completely blind Monica and Derek to the executioner's axe hanging directly over their heads. I pulled into my gravel driveway, the heavy tires crunching loudly in the quiet night. The house was completely dark, exactly as I had left it. I walked inside, moving straight to my private study. I locked the dossier away in the hidden biometric safe beneath my heavy oak desk, securing the explosive truth alongside the encrypted hard drive containing the evidence of their massive corporate pension fraud. I picked up my secure burner phone and dialed Derek's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with forced concern and barely concealed anxiety over my delayed response to their demands. "Dad," he said quickly, "are you okay? I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." I let out a long, ragged, and trembling sigh, intentionally allowing a fragile, weak tremor to enter my voice. I coughed weakly, leaning heavily against the solid mahogany desk to simulate a man physically collapsing under the weight of his own sorrow. "I am sorry, Derek," I whispered, making my words sound thin, hollow, and completely exhausted. "I have just been so incredibly tired. The grief, it is finally catching up with me. I feel like I am drowning in it." I paused, letting the heavy silence hang on the line, ensuring he fully absorbed the pathetic image of his broken father. "I think you and Monica should come over tonight," I continued weakly. "I have made a final decision about the emergency succession agreement." I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Of course, Dad," Derek replied, his voice instantly smoothing out into a practiced, soothing tone of fake relief. "We will be right there. Don't worry about a thing." I spent the next hour carefully staging my study. I dimmed the overhead lamps, casting the room in deep, melancholic shadows. I placed a large framed photograph of Diane prominently on the center of my desk, angling it so her bright, smiling face would be the first thing anyone saw upon entering. I unbuttoned my collar, ruffled my gray hair to make it look unkempt, and deliberately slouched my posture in the leather chair. I was a man who had built a $15 million empire through sheer willpower and ruthless negotiation. But tonight, I was going to play the role of a pathetic, crumbling widower who had finally surrendered to the crushing weight of his own sorrow. When the heavy brass doorbell finally rang, I did not rush to answer it. I moved with slow, deliberate, and shuffling steps, leaning heavily on the banister as I walked down the grand staircase. I opened the heavy oak door. Derek and Monica stood on the stone porch, both dressed in understated, expensive clothing, their faces arranged in masks of deep, performative sympathy. "Dad," Derek said softly, stepping inside and wrapping his arms around my shoulders in a brief, awkward hug. Monica followed closely behind him, offering a tight, sympathetic smile that did absolutely nothing to hide the sharp, predatory gleam in her cold eyes. We walked back to my study. I sank heavily into my large leather chair behind the desk, letting my shoulders slump completely forward. I kept my hands resting flat on the mahogany desktop, deliberately allowing my fingers to tremble slightly. Derek and Monica took their seats in the 2 leather chairs facing me. I looked at the framed photograph of